Hey there, thanks for tuning into Duckbricks. I'm Chris, and on a recent visit to Copenhagen, Denmark, I got a chance to meet up with co-creator of LEGO Bionicle, LEGO Star Wars, LEGO Racers, yes, LEGO Hero Factory, Christian Faber, who gave me some pretty interesting information as to the original story behind Hero Factory. Now, there are so many documents to dive into here, too much to cover in one video. So this video is going to be focused on just the initial brief for what Hero Factory's storyline was actually supposed to be. Much like Bionicle, there was a giant dark twist that would not be revealed until the end of the theme, but unfortunately, we never actually got a chance to have that play out in the storyline, but that story was about to go crazy. There is also a separate Hero Factory story bible that is incredibly thick, has many pages of illustrations and drawings, and that will be the topic of a future video, and we might even get Faber himself to cameo in that one. So stay tuned for that, but for right now, I couldn't just keep the secret to myself. Let's uncover what was the dark secret behind LEGO Hero Factory. Despite being a spiritual successor to Bionicle in many ways, Hero Factory never quite got the complexity or depth of storytelling that Bionicle or even other LEGO themes like Ninjago or Monkey Kid managed to achieve even in their later years. Despite the fact that it lasted much longer than many other original LEGO themes, Hero Factory's story was fairly simple and honestly not that complex. Story was, a factory churned out heroes who went on missions all throughout the galaxy, defeating villains and eventually returning home for more upgrades the next product cycle. There never was really any deep characterization or story depth. Even when the theme launched, we just got a little bit of character development for the rookies, but really just not much substance to the story itself. Well, that was not always supposed to be the case, and Hero Factory actually had a very surprisingly dark and hidden secret behind the storytelling that was meant to be a surprise twist reveal. Similar to the Bionicle Great Spirit robot reveal, this was going to shatter viewers' revelations about the Hero Factory line to their core, and eventually disrupt what it meant to be in the Hero Factory universe entirely. Unfortunately, that never really came to be. And after several attempts to set up cliffhanger endings, such as the end of Breakout, Invasion from Below, or Brain Attack, none of which ever led anywhere, most fans were resigned to the fact that Hero Factory was never really supposed to be that deep. And that's honestly what I believed until now. And so let's take a look at some pretty interesting early documents from the development of LEGO Hero Factory that would have seen a very major tonal shift and a dark secret hidden beneath Mecha Hero Factory. It all begins with this document. This is the original document where Christian Faber, co-creator of LEGO Bionicle, LEGO Star Wars, and so much more, sketched out the first ideas of what would eventually become Hero Factory. And again, many thanks to Christian Faber for actually entrusting me with these documents to showcase for all of you. I'll be scanning in all of these in greater detail as part of a wider media release, so stay tuned for that. But I just couldn't wait and wanted to put out this video first before I actually managed to scan in every single piece of information. And again, this is just the beginning. There is a massive Hero Factory story bible with dozens of pages that I'll be taking a look at much later on, but I just wanted to start off with just these initial documents before we even get into that. So at the bottom of this document, and also if you start reading the text, you might be seeing a couple of hints as to where exactly we're going with that dark secret behind Hero Factory. But before we get into that, let's just take a look at some of these early concepts. Obviously, this was before we had the name Hero Factory, and it actually was originally supposed to be just called Make a Hero, or Mecha Hero, or even Hero Academy. Obviously, Hero Factory was one of the choices, and you can see it's underlined there as probably a pretty good choice they went for, but before that, they were trying to come up with all sorts of different ideas, one of which even still has the Bionicle name attached to it. Now, what's really interesting is that Hero Factory initially had a really fascinating concept, and you're going to see a lot more of that when we go through the original, not necessarily the story bible, but kind of the original story brief. And that entire concept was that heroes would travel to different worlds, and each of the worlds would be themed around something either historical or a different culture or something relating to our actual history. So for instance, heroes could travel to a Viking world or a Dino world. There's a Wild West world that's explored there. And for each of these missions, heroes would be outfitted for that particular journey. It's almost similar to what Ninjago was doing in the most recent years, where we'd have a steampunk year, or we would have an underwater year. That basically, Hero Factory was trying to be a ubiquitous action figure theme, where you could make heroes that tie into all sorts of different worlds. Now, of course, there's a lot of different story details here, but let's just go on to the more concrete details, which is, of course, Bionicle presents the Hero Factory. Now, this was, of course, the initial story draft for what Hero Factory was supposed to be. And I'm going to be going through this document in detail because it is probably one of the most interesting LEGO documents ever, mostly because we haven't really seen a lot of these story details in the actual mainline story. So Hero Factory was initially, and we'll take a look at this later on, but it was initially supposed to track the journeys of a hero named Vito Dash, and Vito Dash is, I guess, kind of a prototype version of Preston Stormer and William Furno. They're kind of like a mix between the two, but this is basically where the story begins. But I'm going to start off by the overview. So basically, Bionicle presents the Hero Factory, which is a place where heroes are designed and created and sent off to meet the demands of global and galactic customers. The factory is kind of like a fantasy version of Billund, where the heroes and their stories are created, and that is the crucial part there. Obviously, you have all of these specialists that work to produce the heroes needed by different clients. So you've got high-tech soldiers in space, caveman heroes battling dinosaur villains of prehistoric worlds. And that was really the whole concept behind Hero Factory, was that each of the heroes were supposed to be extremely specialized to the mission, where you'd have like cowboy hats for a cowboy version and so on and so forth. Obviously, all the parts of the hero are meticulously produced and individually shaped to fit the task, and they can actually make new or old design directions, so of course you have all sorts of different things. So obviously there are complications in perfecting the product, just like in any big company, where there's conflict and trouble inside the factory itself. So obviously, the heroes going on their travels and trips, the story and location possibilities were pretty limitless, but as a thread, the factory and the decisions made by the factory were kind of supposed to be a running thread behind all of Hero Factory. And that's where we get to the dark secret, not to be communicated for many years. So here was the point behind Hero Factory, the entire point of it, which I think is a brilliant idea, but maybe a little bit too advanced for what LEGO was trying to tell in terms of story at the time, was that whenever a hero is made, a villain is also made from the waste in the dark underbelly of the factory. A whole dark factory underneath Makihiro Factory operates on the high-tech waste and scrap of the hero production, so the factory delivers both the sickness and the cure. I feel like this is a really interesting idea, and it is one of the most timely story ideas, especially now in modern times. I feel like it could be a really compelling story to tell, where especially since that is the big twist of the entire Hero Factory story, that is so cool that the factory is not as good as it seems, and they're literally creating villains to battle the heroes. And I feel like that could lead to so many different types of character development where the heroes have to grapple with their whole existence, and maybe some of them are genuinely trying to do the right thing, maybe others are going to be in on the whole story, and they're just having these fights for show. And I feel like this is the kind of thing that you can do in, I mean, kids media has done it before. I feel like it's not the most original idea. I feel like you can absolutely get these kind of fake heroes and villains type of storytelling, especially with something like a Megamind type story, but maybe for LEGO, this is kind of a dark twist that potentially they just decided they didn't really necessarily want to go in that direction. No matter how that idea got scrapped, I don't know exactly when in the process it happened, but that was the entire point behind Hero Factory. The whole reason why the story actually existed was to actually emphasize that the Hero Factory was actually evil and producing the sickness and the cure, which is again a very good story. It almost is kind of like The Boys or whatever you would see nowadays in superhero media, which is really interesting, but sadly just nothing that we ever really got a chance to cover. So there it is. That's a dark secret behind Hero Factory, but there's a lot more, and I feel like this is really a birthing point of so many other stories that you could get into in the Hero Factory world. So here they're trying to give some ideas of what stories can you tell in the Hero Factory universe if you're doing a TV show. There is an idea about like a Robin Hood hero, so you've kind of got a castle-themed hero thing. Of course, there's a dinosaur-themed one, there's a space colony with shape-shifting aliens, a hero mutiny, which is quite interesting. So what does it take to stay a hero when wealth and power come calling? That's actually another really interesting concept that they totally could have discussed. Of course, Earth is Calling was kind of teased in some of the commercials, but nothing really explored in the actual TV show itself or the mainline story, and then you have a lot of other ideas as well. But I think that in terms of LEGO Hero Factory, really the only story that we actually got was how to become a hero in terms of an underdog fighting to move up in the system and earning a mission. Or I guess it was the journey of William Furno becoming an actual hero rather than just a rookie. So again, so much potential here, so much backstory could have been explored with Hero Factory, but unfortunately just never really got to this level. And here is actually the explanation behind the children enjoying Hero Factory and a chance for them to be able to become part of the property. So of course there was that dark factory design even in the very beginning of the story, where that when you create your own unique hero, which eventually would become Hero Recon Team, maybe an evil version is also automatically created in the dark factory. So you have an evil version of your hero, which I think is a really, really cool idea. So the more powerful the heroes become, the more powerful the villains are also made. So that would have been nice, but unfortunately didn't really get to see that. And then there's also a bit here about new product features, about a backpack. And again, this isn't really something we ever got to see, because they had pitched this concept of a backpack being equipped in design and texture from launch to launch. So you can have fabric or rubber or hard shell, and it indicates they're going away for a trip and need to equip themselves. And I think that would have been a nice accessory piece to have different unique backpacks being their own collectibles. Kind of like a similar thing to the masks of Bionicle. Obviously you can collect the helmets, but you also can collect the backpack with equipment. Maybe actually integrating that into the toys didn't really make sense when it came to prototyping, but I still think that would have been a really, really fun idea. But moving on from this first page, the second page is actually going into what the story was going to be. So the idea behind the story was a synopsis behind this misplaced hero story, the right heroes landing in the wrong place. And that is just one of the many, many ideas they had. So this is just kind of the first idea they had, which is kind of a very basic hero story. So it centers on Vito Dash and a squad of crack mercenaries who are the most powerful, proficient, and charismatic heroes the factory has ever made. They have been designed to take on the brutal, tireless, shape-shifting aliens, but unfortunately they veer wildly off course to basically be in the middle of nowhere. They're high-tech heroes, but they're not really suited for a place with dust and sand, and they basically have to kind of walk into these different ridiculous situations, forced to turn to the locals for help. And again, this is kind of like a Wild West sort of themed planet that they find their way onto. And Vito is trying to maintain their fitness and determination, and obviously this was kind of increasing some comedy into the series as well. They were getting thrown into these wild scenarios until one day, when they're at their lowest, evil strikes, and the heroes are caught off guard and plunged into a deep crisis. So this is going to be some sort of a plot of the episode. They're trying to improvise using the equipment they have, and of course that would be just the beginning of the story. That would be like an episode 1 introduction to the characters, because they were just made, they go off on this first mission, and then they're thrown wildly off course. But then it seems that from there they decide to go into the freelance mercenary business as guns for hire. So I guess they just decide not to work for the Hero Factory anymore after this, and they just kind of do their own thing, so, which is a very interesting story to take it. I think that that would have been a good storyline for future years of the Hero Factory if we were following a group of characters, but I think for the first year you really do want to establish your story, establish the factory, and you'd ideally want them to actually be working for the Hero Factory in, I would say, the first year of the story. But I think that's a really good idea for a future year. And then they have a side story and end story on a particularly brutal afternoon on the People's Republic of Trevor. That is wild connotations in that simple statement right there. But Vito's running into a vicious platoon of mercenaries, and they realize that they possess very similar weapons, moves, and strategies, but they have to wonder where exactly did they come from, and how do they seem to understand how the team works. During the battle, they souvenir kind of a body part from the rogues, and carved into the carbon fiber is a mark that shocks them, which is the Makihiro factory logo. So of course, they return to the factory, and this would be probably one of the final years, I would imagine, where they would kind of face off against evil versions of themselves, and they learn that the evil villains are created by the Makihiro factory and are delivered to an unsuspecting planet, so they dominate supply by creating the demand. So of course they journey back to Makihiro factory for the final showdown. So again, this seems to be kind of the main storyline over multiple years, where kind of you have the first year here, which I'm guessing is character development as they're working for the Hero Factory. You have future years of them becoming mercenaries and taking on different villain vanquishing missions. And then finally you have almost like a part 1 and part 2 here, where I assume part 1 of the year could be focused on them fighting these villain mercenaries, and then part 2 could be this big showdown at the factory itself, which I think would have made for a really interesting story to tell. But sadly, they just never really went in that direction. The only other document I have right now is this one right here, which showcases some artwork for Hero Factory. So obviously you have the Hero Factory right there, and then the reflection in the water was always meant to mimic the villain factory just lurking underneath. And that's why in a lot of promotional material, especially for year 1, which presumably I guess they were still planning some form of this twist in year 1, but promotional material literally shows the reflection in the water, suggesting at this villain factory underneath. So again, that was something that they at least had in the back of their heads when they first had year 1, but we'll see if that will continue in the future. And then onto here, this is just an illustration of them kind of landing in the middle of nowhere and encountering the first locals. And then of course you have some of the early designs for Vito and his squad, who are really just heavily armed mercenaries for the Hero Factory, but they've stumbled upon this backwater planet here, which I think is quite funny. And it's a good juxtaposition to really just have them be facing their own wits and at their own ends and trying to figure out how to survive in this planet. So that's basically it. This is probably the most important duo of documents here, because you have the initial story for what the big idea was behind Hero Factory, and then just kind of a little time capsule. It's almost like a microcosm of the story being told with Vito and the team, as well as this really interesting document. We're going back to this first one, obviously from the very inception of Hero Factory. It is about finding out about the waste of the Makihiro Factory. Every time a hero is made, a villain is made as well. So of course you have people figuring out what their mission is. Again, you have all these different ideas for going to these different worlds, and you can create a hero finding the waste. And of course, I guess it was called Vaste, like villain waste. That's quite funny, like it's the Vaste. And then hero and villain, where that is right there, the reflection underneath. So again, super interesting plotline. I personally really wish they went in this direction. I think that would have made the craziest plot twist ever, and it's pretty rare for a LEGO theme to do something like this, where the heroes that you're supposedly working for are actually turning out to be the bad guys. I think that maybe the storyline, back in 2010, 2011, arguably could have been a little bit too complex to focus on a corrupt corporation and what it means to actually be a hero, and grappling with a lot of psychological concepts of, well, if the corporation that made me is evil, should I even exist? And I think there's a lot of rich storytelling that could happen there, but again, maybe a little bit too mature for what Hero Factory was trying to do. And so unfortunately, all of these really good ideas about Hero Factory are just relegated to concepts, and they never were meant to be. But now you know the dark secret behind Hero Factory, and definitely stay tuned, because I do want to be going through the entire multi-page story bible chock full of illustrations. That is absolutely going to be a future video, and I would actually love to maybe have Christian Faber on the channel talking through that as well, so stay tuned for that. But that's all for this video. Hope you enjoyed, and this has been a really interesting episode diving into strange documents in the history and creation of LEGO Hero Factory. Alright, and with that, we have summed up the original LEGO Hero Factory Story Bible pitch. What do you think of this early idea for what Hero Factory was supposed to be? Personally, I think that would have been an incredible twist, maybe a little bit too nuanced and layered for a property like Hero Factory, which always was focused more on telling stories to younger kids than Bionicle. But oh my goodness, Would that have been one crazy twist to end the theme on? I certainly wish they did it, but unfortunately, it is never meant to be. I'm just glad I got to share it now. That's all for this video. Thank you so much, and stay tuned for even more documents to be uncovered from Faber's massive LEGO vault. Bye for now.